I wanted to just start again by acknowledging that we're on, or that WISH is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and you all may be calling in from different places. But we're focusing tonight on the impacts of COVID-19 and on specific sex work populations that our panelists are going to speak of. And I think it's really important that we feel into the places that we're in and really acknowledge the work that's being done in this particular moment. So I want to start by really thanking the panelists for taking time out of, I know, very busy lives. And I know, Lyra, you have been on holidays and vacation and even organizing with us for the panel discussion while doing that. So I appreciate you all taking your time. So what we are focusing on tonight is really looking at the impacts that COVID-19 has had on the unique populations that our panelists are working with, and the populations that they're working with specifically. And so we're going to hear from, and maybe I'll get you to give a little wave when I say your name, Eva Ureta, who is the Supported Employment Coordinator at the WISH Drop-In Center. Thanks for joining us. We've got Kelly Go, who has been working with SWAN since 2016, and she's the Outreach Coordinator. And SWAN focuses on migrant and immigrant sex workers. We've got Lyra, McKee. Hi, thank you for joining us. And she's the co-executive director of PACE, which is a grassroots nonprofit working run by and for sex workers of all genders. And then Spencer Johnston. Hi, thank you so much. Working with the Health Initiative for Men as a program coordinator of community engagement. And so all of our panelists bring a really important perspective on the impacts of sex work, the impacts of COVID on sex workers. But what's important in this discussion is we really want to frame it as this is not speaking or representative about the experiences of all sex workers by any means, but really this is informed by the lived experience of the panelist members and really what they're hearing from the folks that they work with. And so we're learning a lot, and what we know right now is there isn't a lot of really good data about how COVID is affecting sex workers in particular. There was a study that the consortium ran in early March or mid-March of this year, just after COVID started, and they looked at the impacts that COVID was starting to have. And so this initial research had 95 responses from sex workers that were living around the downtown east side. And they were surveyed about the effects of the pandemic in this early stage, had really only been a few weeks, and looking at the ways that we might be able to respond more effectively. And so what that initial survey found is that almost 50% of respondents reported that their business, even at that point, had been significantly impacted by the pandemic. There'd been dramatic decreases in income and a lot of difficulties in just affording everyday amenities. The report also lays out knowledge and resource gaps of sex workers in the downtown east side, and a lot of the concerns about how to actually connect with services that will provide supports, particularly around COVID-19, but that have specific services or care that would meet the unique needs of sex workers. And so there's a lot that we don't know, but this panel is really designed to be hopefully the start of many conversations that we can continue to have to continue to actually deepen our understanding of the pandemic and the way that it affects, in particular, marginalized groups of people. And so given the expertise that the evening today will be focused on migrant and immigrant sex workers and street-based sex workers, as well as male sex workers. And we hope that these are conversations that we can continue to really get a fuller understanding of how the kind of multiple and diverse sex workers are actually experiencing the intensity of the pandemic, which is not going away. So that's a bit of the framing where we're at, and we're going to go through a series. We have 3 questions that we created ahead of time just to streamline the conversation. And what we'll be doing is, in the same way as the second part of the AGM, there will be questions that are open, and you can, if any of the audience members have questions, you're welcome to send those to the moderators, and then we'll try to collate questions, and they'll try to feed them to me, and we'll try to have a conversation, wishing we were all in person, but doing what we can and learning Zoom platforms along the way. So I think we should dive in from there. And what we'll do is I'll ask each of you to give a brief summary of the first question. And if you want to provide any further introductory information about who you are, then you're welcome to do that. So the first question that we wanted to get your perspective on was, who do you and your organization work with? So what groups of sex workers, and what types of sex worker people engaged in, and how specifically is this group of sex workers being affected by COVID? And Lyra, I'm wondering if you would be okay with starting the conversation off. And again, feel free to provide any more robust intro information as well.
Sure. My name is Lyra McKee. I am community-based co-executive director at Peace Society, which means I deal with member engagement, public relations, communications, most outward-facing issues, as well as some work with the board on strategic planning. So a challenge for me in my position has been connecting with members because I'm not on the front lines most of the time, but it is something that I've been working on. And what we've seen at a number of levels is that sex workers are facing, as Lisa already mentioned, a drastic decrease in income because of the shutdowns and the important public protocols that have been made by and health directives that have been made, and that sex workers, as far as we've seen, generally do want to follow. And my PACE works with sex workers of all genders. We're very proud to have served sex workers of all genders since 1994 in all of Metro Vancouver, but we are based in the downtown east side. So we do see a great deal of street-based sex workers in our drop-in and in our programs. But again, we serve all sex workers of all types, of all genders in Vancouver. And so we've seen a drastic decrease in income as businesses and various types of work have been opening up again. We've seen sex workers have to choose between security in their health and security in their financials, in terms of they've had to decide whether they can work, how they can work safely. We've seen that COVID, well, we had to shut our doors to our drop-in for several months at the beginning of COVID, when things were a little less sure, and everything was changing every day, as it still sort of is. And so there was also a lack of access to services, especially gender-appropriate services, culturally relevant services. And we have opened our drop-in as a window now that people can come up to one at a time, but not without accessing the full space. So and housing has been a huge issue, a lack of affordable housing, housing precarity, and just kudos to Wish for starting the shelter. It's going to make a huge difference, I know, for a lot of sex workers who are facing some dire circumstances. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can get to some of the issues that I missed later on.
Great, thank you, Lyra. Yeah, and I appreciate just the context and just that framing of having to choose between safety and income. So there's safety and actually just basic rights and basic health. So there's a lot of complexity in the issues that we're addressing here. And I wonder if Eva, if you could build on what Lyra has framed out for us, given that you are also working in the downtown east side, and not the same groups of people, but there might be some more overlap there.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining for our first virtual AGM. My name is Eva, and I am the Supportive Employment Manager at WISH. And so my programs provide financial opportunity for women using our largest program, which is the Drop-In Center, to identify women that want to create some change in their life. And we do that through volunteer programs and 3 employment programs. So we have a pool of about 40 women working at WISH, and then another 15 volunteering at the time. So I was asked to be on the panel to bring forward how women that access the space have been affected by COVID. And so I asked women working at the Drop-In, working at the shelter, peer witness and peer volunteer program, and a variety of women that access the space morning, evening, and overnight, because those 3 demographics are actually quite different when we talk about street-based sex work. The women were very happy to see that the AGM was giving them space and time to bring forward stories in the safest possible way. So what I'm going to say might seem a bit disjointed, but I really want to get across their exact words and what they wanted to bring forward on this panel. And I should mention that these women are those that have informed, shaped services and programs and entire nonprofits in this community, as well as WISH. So to suddenly have these disappear through the span of 3 days had a profound impact on the community. And so when I asked how COVID affected their livelihood and safety, they had a lot to say. So it's not too surprising that the first thing that came up was that resources were next to nil. So several women recalled the sudden loss of access to critical services. And this was identified as clothing, hygiene products, as well as bathrooms and showers, programming and information, particularly the ability for anyone to give an explanation as to what was coming down the pipe 24 to 48 hours, even a week from when these shutdowns started. People were scrambling and no one had answers. That's a direct quote. And that there was so much confusion and I lost access to TV, news, and my community. And a lot of women saying that they can't go through this again, which we are now in the second wave. And I think across the board, we're handling that as service providers and programmers the best we can. There's also a lot of concern that was voiced around clothing, food, and PPE. So no one is handing out masks, and they're finding it really hard to approach service providers and say, hey, I need a mask, and then getting looked at as being irresponsible during the pandemic for not having this PPE on them at all times. And then quoting, even if I do have money to buy PPE, we can't find it in stores. There's also a lot of trust that has been broken. So in a quote, we trust our circle of community resources, but now more than ever, they seem to be our lifelines to information and even more our health and safety when I feel like I have nowhere else to go. So getting an update on what is happening, where it's happening, at what time, this was very hard to keep up with. And I know a lot of services that remained open, there were entire groups of people tasked with just putting together up-to-date lists of what was easily accessible, a change in times, which programs had maybe dissolved, even in the short term, and how to go about finding that somewhere else in the safest way. So a lot of people recalled when the closures started. This seems to be still felt as if it's going to happen again, just as sudden as it happened the first time. So quoting, the place I was staying at handed me all my stuff in storage bins and basically evicted everyone. So we saw a lot of sudden closures of spaces where women could hang out during the day and would store their stuff. And then one day they showed up and they were given all their stuff and told just to take it. Quote, I was so overwhelmed, I didn't know where to go. I was turned away so many times that I got rid of all my possessions. Now, this isn't uncommon with some people getting evicted from housing, but when you have a housing crisis, and on top of that, you have a pandemic, to suddenly show up to what you call your home and your community, and someone passes you all your stuff. I had many conversations with women that were like, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. I felt like I was always 10 minutes behind another closure in the community. And a lot of women ended up just leaving their stuff. And I think anyone who was suddenly handed all their stuff would find it really difficult to find where to put that stuff. Under sex work, quote, I've been affected a lot. We weren't in a position to be picky about our johns, referring to the current laws prior to COVID. But now, how do we keep social distance on a date? How do we screen for COVID? They can just say no, referring to they haven't been in contact with anyone that tested positive. Quote, it's not like I can take their temperature. Well, that's very true. A lot of women are very upset that they don't have the proper PPE while they're at work. And I think this is really, they framed it as a work safe issue. Everyone else has access to this. If the city really wanted to keep us safe, they would provide everyone with, quote, a care kit. And that's referencing what one of the women said. You would provide us with all those things so that we could properly and safely do our work, just like everyone else in the community is trying to do. So there was a very sudden loss with work. And then I'm just gonna do a few more quotes and then I'll pass it along. Quote, around the clock, there has been pretty scary stuff. As a professional, don't have the tools to be safe. Recommendation on safe sex during COVID are great, but how am I to do that in my line of work? Lastly, we deserve a chance. We shouldn't feel so unsafe and unprotected.
Thanks, Eva. It's moving to hear the direct words, you know, and also to feel into how quick it was, like this, you know, that if you're not living in those same circumstances where there's this deep reliance on these resources and they're there, and then 1 hour to the next they're closed, and so you can feel the kind of urgency. And I'm really considering all this. In this particular moment, I know that Dr. Bonnie Henry today, like there's more restrictions that are going into place. And so as we think forward to the a second wave, and as it gets worse, how do we actually mitigate some of these impacts that were so horrendous the first time round? And is there ways to learn from that? So thank you for taking the time also to connect directly with the women. Spence, I'd love to hear from you about what you're seeing at HIM.
Hey, so we work primarily with GBT2Q guys who participate in a variety of sex work. Many of our clients are involved in survival sex work, but we also support folks across the spectrum. Our clients have been affected in ways similar to other organizations and communities. I mean, right now, unfortunately, we're all currently moving through a triple layer of pandemics. You know, we have COVID-19, we have a tainted supply reaching a fever pitch of overdoses, and we have depression, isolation, and suicide affecting everybody. Many of our street-based clients have had their communities splintered. One of the hardest things has been kind of the unknown. People stop showing up and then not knowing, have they relocated? Are they rehoused? Did they overdose? Are they sick? Are they isolating? We've had many of our folks return at this point, but there's still people missing and we don't know why, and that's stressful. There's also been a large migration to online platforms, which has sort of gentrified the virtual neighborhood and displaced a lot of workers who rely on digital content. Obviously, sex workers having less clients due to COVID has been a factor, leading to concerns around housing, food scarcity, supply, as well as stigma within sex work communities, and an additional layer of stigma from those outside those communities. CERB access for those who don't have IDs or a bank account or taxes filed has been a huge barrier for navigating folks to those resources for the entire time. Accessing resources and supports has been more of a challenge in general, as we're all aware. But one of the most heartening things back in March, when this all started happening, was seeing so many organizations and communities coming together to address these things.
Do you have an example, Spence, of just something that you saw in terms of organizations coming together?
Yeah, so actually it was spoken to today, and this was the needs and risk assessment that came out, and then the report that was produced from that, and seeing so many organizations from WISH, PACE, Aboriginal Front Door Society, HIM, SWAN, Living in Community, and everybody associated with that. You know, lots of people were interested in pitching in on it, you know, and really just trying to kind of be reactive to when this first happened, and how quickly it happened. I thought was really impressive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Yeah, and we're going to, closer to the end, we're going to talk about, you know, what are the kind of your calls to action, and what can we actually do from here once we've sort of painted a bit more of a picture of what the landscape is. So Kelly, I'd love to now get your perspective on, you know, what you're seeing around with migrant and immigrant sex workers in Vancouver and the surrounding areas.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Kelly. SWAN supports this health, safety, and well-being of immigrant, migrant, newcomer, self-identified women working in massage parlor and apartments. And the people we serve are at the intersection of criminal law and immigration prohibition, which means that migrants are prohibited from working in the sex industry due to the immigration prohibition. And as a result, the risk of deportation is something that the people we serve have to face every day. For COVID, COVID means that many of the people we serve were out of a job, especially during the time when massage parlors were ordered to be closed, and majority of the women we serve are not eligible for any governmental financial relief because many of them have precarious immigration status. And as a result, SWAN organized a community consultation that was carried out by the women themselves. And the consultation was to better understand the specific needs and to gather some questions from the community. And from that consultation, on top of the loss of employment, we also learned that women are dealing with facing lots of myths surrounding COVID. They also have lots of concerns that authorities might overstep their mandate under the guise of public health. And they also explain that the information regarding rights of employees working in a licensed business was also very because the information kept on changing at the beginning. So they also point out how difficult it is just for them to understand what's going on. So as a result, we created a Chinese, both in Cantonese and Mandarin, COVID related information booklet compiled with all of the questions that the woman had raised. And it also included information about their rights as an employee. And at the same time, COVID has had an unprecedented impact on, well, really everyone's livelihood, resulting in loss of income. And as women begin to return to work, we have also decided to, as an organization, we need to buy PPE, so including masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer to distribute to the women during outreach, and also when they want to come to our space, they could also pick them up there. And I talked a bit about how a lot of the women that we serve they're not eligible for any financial relief fund from the government. So we have also created a low barrier relief fund for the women. But the uptick was quite slow at the beginning, and that was also it's because of the multiple layers of oppressions that the women are already facing before COVID. There are women who told us that they are reluctant in accepting the fund because it could lead to questioning from other governmental agencies such as MCFD or other government affiliated agency, especially with questioning around like where the money is coming from, and also the fear that it might be traced back to SWAN. If that's the case, then there's also this fear that it could out their sex working status and inadvertently lead to deportation or scrutiny or even more surveillance from these agencies. So yeah, these are some of the things that we have been dealing with.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. So there's for differing reasons, but there's some similarities around lack of access to PPE and not having access to financial relief. So that being outside of what the requirements that government has for whether it's immigration status or ID or all the multiple barriers that are in place that have made it very difficult for sex workers to get CERB or any other kind of financial relief. So I'm hearing that as sort of some similarities among all of you. And I would just encourage, if anybody in the audience has any specific questions, if you want to let us know, because those questions will go to us as moderators, and I can feed those into the panelists as well. So if questions are coming up from any of what's been said already, I just encourage you to put those questions into the chat. And Kelly, I wonder if you wanted to say anything further just around, you talked a lot about immigration status already, but I'm curious about how race and gender has played a role in terms of how the sex workers you have been working with are being impacted by COVID.
Yeah, so here at SWAN, race is at the heart of all of the work that we do. Racism, especially anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, feel like they have always been around, and COVID simply heightens these issues. I think racism and exclusion go hand in hand. So for migrant workers who are in the sex industries, they are marginalized in their exclusion of financial support from the government and may not be able to stay home or stop work together because they need to have income. And the other thing too, the fact that migrant workers are prohibited from working in the sex industry because of immigration regulation also shows like just how this exclusion are affecting their livelihood. It's making it very unsafe for women to work. And even before COVID, this is a very serious issue because just because of this exclusion, it means that even when bad things happen, migrant sex workers have nowhere to report. And at the same time, like this immigration regulation that I keep on talking about, it's really based on a very racist assumption about non-white women doing sex work, and Asian women are always seen as this victim, and they're framed within a victim narrative. And this also really points to how the state believes sex work leads to human trafficking, and as a result, woman needs to be protected. And this is really problematic, and because it leads to an increased pressure for border security to keep the racialized others out. And it really just create a very unsafe environment for sex work, for migrants in the sex industry. And COVID led to an increase of anti-migrant rhetoric as well. And that combined with the existing conflation between sex work and trafficking also means that women are facing with increased surveillance, and at the same time there is an increased fear of police and by law enforcement, as I mentioned before, visits from police or by law enforcement with the reasoning of ensuring public safety during COVID. So that's some of the things that I thought of.
Wow, there's so much in what you said. I have lots of questions and want to ask more. But I think what you're really pointing to is the ways that the prohibition within the women's immigration status to engage in sex work means that they actually have, if they're experience violence, or they actually, something happens and they are engaged in sex work, they fear deportation, and they have actually nowhere to turn in terms of being supported and having resources. So there's a lot that's tied up in the immigration laws and in the kind of racist and racism that's embedded within, and maybe sexism that's embedded within those policies. So I appreciate you, unpacking a piece of that a lot. And I'm curious just around this question around how others are seeing race and gender impacting COVID in particular. I wonder if Eva, you want to speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, for sure. Asking that question to the women, it very much turned into a safety issue. So for a lot of the women engaged in street-based sex work, racism or discrimination might not be something that is new to them. That's something that they've had to grapple with in this line of work for a very long time. Yeah, police are out there and they're patrolling, but the police weren't actually brought up in a lot of these stories. What was brought up is this idea of community being there for community, and how that completely got lost during the pandemic. So a lot of the stories that I heard were very much like right when there were shutdowns, right up until what they're experiencing today, and the fear of this happening again and again through every wave. And so for one woman, she described that racism is not new to me. I know the dangers when I'm out there. What I didn't count on is how isolated I would be. No phones. It just so happened her phone was stolen. Terrible timing. It happens a lot, and it does have an impact on personal safety. There were no cars on the street. No businesses were open, and described it as a very eerie pin drop type experience. She expressed that on some nights, this fear was so overwhelming that she had to cut her shift early and go home. So this meant that most nights she did go home without any money. On the flip side of that, the pandemic did provide a lot of crisis money. So this particular person did start working in one of our programs, and she did identify that having the option of working at the drop-in center, where we capitalize off of her lived experience and what she wants to do in the program, that did save her from what a lot of sex workers lost, which is financial income and a steady flow of it. So she did recognize that some services were still open and making people as financially whole as possible. Another woman commented on overall the community seemed fractured. Where was everyone? Are they okay? And where can I find them? So not only was there a fear of, are my sisters okay? The concerns were compounded over time, with one woman saying, I felt so alone, unsafe. I felt like I was being denied access to my community. And Spence touched on this for sure, about this sudden disappearance of people. Where are they? Are they okay? Where can I find them? When will I see them again? And these are people that were part of their everyday lives and really part of their support and security when working. So lastly, I'll point to this one, expressing that there are less people out there, therefore it feels less safe to screen and have people have eyes on you. Some buildings experience lockdowns. So we've heard of this throughout the pandemic, where someone would have to get testing, and then the building would shut down completely, locking everyone in pending multiple test results. So when this happens, the women lost their spotters. So a lot of their spotters were in the building or in neighboring buildings. So, quote, being trans, I was scared. No one was around. I felt unsafe. Like if I needed help, would anyone be there for me? So thank you for everyone for pointing out that this really disconnected people, not only from services, but from each other. And that very much through these interviews, the safety issue was pointed out almost every single time, making work very unsafe and therefore a real gap in their finances, and then having access to make that whole again. Yeah.
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, that importance that safety is actually provided by the community itself, not just by the resources. So that making that distinction is really important. And the ways that COVID, it was eerily quiet. You know, the streets were empty for that time, and it'd be interesting to kind of see how that isolation is continuing to play out for some people in that way. Lyra, I wonder if you could share just your perspective and what you're hearing around kind of just the impacts of race and gender and how that intersects with the impacts of COVID.
Sure. So I think, as has already been mentioned, COVID has exacerbated and made more evident how gender and race and other factors of oppression or racism and transphobia and different systems of oppression single people out and make access to services, access to livelihoods uneven and not equal across the board. I think it's exposed the lack of support that a lot of communities have for what many of us might consider human rights or just basic necessities of shelter, food, medication, medical care. All of these gaps in access are being exacerbated by COVID. And then I think also there's something about the friction between communities and individuals who experience oppression and the way the capitalist state interacts or different systems of power interact with those individuals and communities, and that friction at that interface where those systems meet is being exposed. So what I mean by that is that the stigma and criminalization of sex work and against sex workers is becoming very obvious in the ways that sex workers don't have access to financial supports, don't have access to social safety nets, but also how gender and race lead to greater isolation for people from communities, because people, sex workers who are both racialized and face oppression in relation to gender, and who are sex workers, can face lateral violence in different segments of those communities. And so I think we're definitely seeing that these factors of oppression lead to greater isolation and desperation in accessing resources and relief.
Yeah, thank you. I think I've heard many people talk about the pandemic as the great revealer. So the folks who have been experiencing racism and many kind of forms of inequity all along, it's like we're actually seeing it in different ways, and it's becoming more apparent, and the impacts are greater because of that. So thank you, Lyra, for sharing that, your views on that. And then Spence, I wonder if you want to share, and if there are any questions that anybody has, you can send them directly to Emily. And we want to make sure to give you, or to hear from each of the panelists as well around what are your calls to action, like what we can do. But I want to make sure to just hear from you, Spence, working with male and male identified sex workers. This kind of question around gender and race is unique in the spaces that you're working in. So I'm curious if you want to share your perspective on that, and then we'll move to the calls to action.
Thank you. So queer and gay spaces are inherently constrained outside of pandemic times. So having those spaces not exist is extremely harmful. Not only due to various forms of sex work becoming inaccessible, but also the community supports for LGBTQ sex workers that is received in those spaces is removed as well. Many queer and gay spaces are inherently sex positive, and sex workers are a part of the foundations of queer space. It's not just a financial toll that's coming from this, it's an emotional and a mental toll being felt right now. Beyond just queer and gay space, it's the loss of intersectional spaces for people who aren't only a queer sex worker, but also Black, also non-binary. The space where folks can find those intersections met within community are so rare. It's really unfortunate for that to not exist right now. I mean, as most folks have spoken to, Lyra, Eva, Kelly, and Lisa, you've all mentioned it's community. It's where you find that community support, and queer and gay spaces are just so limited at the best of times. To have them be non-existent it's detrimental, absolutely, right now to LGBTQ sex workers.
Yeah, that piece around, so there's the resources being closed, but then there's simply the queer spaces being closed. So where people are actually building community and actually finding well-being through connection and being with other folks where it's a safe and welcoming space. That kind of sense of belonging piece is a big one. So there's a way that community provides safety, maybe support while working, but there's these other ways that community is so critical to the kind of foundations of mental health and well-being. So I think what I want to do is we're getting close to the end, and I'm hoping you can all stay for just a few extra minutes, because what I think is really important is that this is to recognize that each of you is bringing a really, really important perspective to the table, and really sharing these lived experiences and of the folks that you're working with, and knowing that there's so many more sex workers that are out there, and actually these experiences we need to actually keep unpacking and understanding. And I've certainly learned a lot, but where I want to leave folks is actually around this question about what can we actually do. So we're in the midst of a pandemic. The numbers are actually way higher than they were when all of these shutdowns were happening in March. So that's the irony. We're at, I don't know how many, almost 200 cases a day. And yet when all the shutdowns were happening, we were, nowhere near that. So we don't know what's coming. We don't know what kind of shutdowns there could be. But if you could invite everybody on this call into one or two things that we could do, or that needs to be done, what would those be? And maybe we'll just go around and we can end on that note of what's your call to action? And we're going to record those, and we're going to make sure that those are we'll send them out to everybody. So if you forget and you didn't write it all down, we'll get it back. We'll send it out to everyone. So you can make sure to tick all of them. So I wonder if, Kelly, do you want to start? Do you have some thoughts around what can we all do? What's one or two things, that are going to make a difference in the safety and well-being of migrant and immigrant sex workers?
I think for the people we serve specifically, I think there is a gap between I think the knowledge around it's not actually just the criminal law that's affecting this group of population, but also a variety of different other things, such as the immigration prohibition, is something that would be great if more people were to understand about that, because I think too, the reason why that prohibition is created, it's because of all of these I guess, assumption from the state about what sex work is, who is doing this, like the whole labeling of victims and criminal too. So it really shows a lot of these assumptions and racism within the law itself. So I think like it would be really helpful for more people to learn about this, because it is affecting a very large group of people who are, I think, really invisible in a way, because they simply don't want to, I guess, get attention in a way that could lead to so many risks such as deportation or losing their job.
Yeah. Thanks, Kelly. So maybe what I could suggest, because I happen to know that SWAN has a lot of great resources around actually building your knowledge. So what you're saying is that the immigration laws are reflective of the racism that's actually present more broadly in our culture. So there's a role that we all can play around educating ourselves and educating those around us around the unique kind of experience of migrant and immigrant sex workers. So maybe somebody could put the SWAN website into the chat, because I think that's a great resource. And I know you guys just had a webinar yesterday about anti-trafficking discourse. So I don't know if that's recorded, but there'll be, hopefully you guys have a lot of resources, I know. So
yeah, everything is on Facebook.
Okay, so check out their Facebook. Okay, so we'll send that out to everybody to follow up. So that's your number one call to action. Okay, educate yourself around migrant and immigrant sex work issues. Thanks, Kelly. Eva, do you want to? You're next on my screen here, so I'm going to come to you.
So yeah, the call to action, that was something that I had to sort of explain, like what that meant, to like kind of go big, like what is the thing that if you could change, you would. And so I sort of framed it in, you were given like a giant megaphone and you had the attention of everyone, policymakers, funders, the city, the government, like everybody. What is the thing that you would say that they would be able to snap their fingers and create the change that you're asking for? And so, not surprising, shelters and housing for everyone was at the top of almost everyone's list. The next that came down the line was around information and PPE and having the proper equipment to safely continue their line of work. And then lastly, which was kind of an odd surprise, there was this discussion about how in Toronto, they would have this community group that was in partnership with the police, where they were given an area where they could do safe sex work, and they would patrol those three corners and provide immediate services to anyone that needed help. Now, obviously, you could do this work anywhere in the city, but on those three corners, there was an understanding that it was like the safe zone, the supported zone, where you could have women with similar lived experience sort of advocating for you if anything went wrong. And so this discussion sort of snowballed to other people being like, yeah, I know about that program, we should get something here. And so one woman identified that we need to have community groups, as well as women with lived experience, not the police, that could be employed to be there on Kingsway and in Vancouver and any other hot spots where anyone engaged in street-based sex work could have the support of women during very certain hours. And I thought that was a great idea if you were to bring anything to the table, especially around COVID and safety and this idea of, a pin dropped and I felt like my life was in danger. That would be a great sort of solution and provide opportunity to a lot of women that I think would really take up to that cause and do a fabulous job.
And that speaks really to the filling that both that need of community and employment, but also of having eyes on the streets as well. That's great. Eva, my internet just cut out for a second when you were finishing the first action. Can you just say it again so I make sure I have it in my mind?
Oh, that's housing and shelters for everyone.
Awesome. Okay, so housing and shelters, information and PPE, and community groups employed to be in the hotspots to actually provide community safety and supports. I love it. Okay, We're getting on it tomorrow. Okay. All right. Lyra, do you want to share your calls to action?
Sure. So I think this is always challenging because what I want to know when I'm asked something like this is who are we calling to action? Is this non-sex workers who want to do something for sex workers? Is this sex workers who want to do something for themselves or each other? And so I think my calls to action are going to be an attempt to be aimed at both. I think I'd like to echo the importance of education. I think all of us can, whether we have sex work experience or not, can inform ourselves better about sex work issues, intersectionality, how our struggles relate to other people's struggles, and then making our voices heard. So taking that education and making your support for sex workers and sex workers' rights issues known. And if you can't do that for various safety reasons, making just maybe trying to reach out in community and make your support known to an individual who might need support at this time.
Great. So there's a sense of education, and this is really, yeah, I mean, I think for everybody on the call, how can we all continue to educate ourselves? And then I hear there's also it's almost like the calls to action then need to come from the sex workers themselves. Like we need to, how can we educate ourselves further and actually be in conversation so that as the calls to action come up, we know how to respond. And I think you also are addressing this piece around intersectionality as a really important part of what we need to all better inform ourselves around. So thank you, Lyra. That's great. And Spence, I'd love to hear your calls to action.
Kind of two-parter, in a more kind of ambitious lens. My two calls to action would be defund the police in favor of social supports and to push the Canadian government to stop criminalizing sex work. In a more kind of what can we do tomorrow lens, it would be advocate and advocate. I definitely hear what Lyra is saying. You know, as folks who are experiential or not, as folks who work with sex workers, as folks who live with sex workers, as folks who may have friends or family or neighbors who are sex workers, we need to speak up and we need to inform and we need to advocate, continuing to inform and educate healthcare providers, policymakers, the general public, to reduce stigma, to share understanding, to break down barriers, to help people understand that sex work is work and it requires the same supports other employment provides. Sex workers deserve to retire. Sex workers deserve to access healthcare without judgment and ignorance defining the experience. Everyone deserves access to a safe supply. You know, we are communities of advocates and activists, and we need to keep pushing against those who hold their ill-informed opinions in high regard.
Thank you, Spence. So I heard many things in there, but maybe if I can summarize just the simply to defund police and to decriminalize sex work. And there was a comment in the chat that came to me about that as the biggest call to action, and actually the harmful impacts of conflating sex work and trafficking are bound up in the criminal law, and actually that is a really important starting point. I also want to just appreciate and underline what you have mentioned a few times today, Spence, is also the opioid pandemic. So we're this like the multiplicities of pandemics that we're all experiencing, and so that a safe supply becomes actually part of the response to the COVID pandemic. And I've been hearing a little more of Bonnie Henry's talking about the number of people that are dying of overdoses in addition to COVID, because there's this way that it, if you look at the numbers and the kinds of responses, you can question that. So this concern around that's overarching is actually how do education being foundational, I think, for all of the different groups of sex workers that you are working with and living with, and as you said, Spence, in the multiple ways, but that actually we can all play a role around that in the conversations that we have. So I just really want to thank you all for taking the time, and thank you because we've gone a few minutes late, and we're kind of collating all of these amazing calls to action, and they'll be posted on our Facebook page. Is that right? Did I see a note around that? We're going to get them to you, and Emily has put them into the chat as well, so it can be like your homework over the next several days. And I would add one thing too. We have a new provincial government, so I think anytime there's a new government, it's always great to tell them that sex work is an issue that needs to be paid attention to. So I hope that this is really the beginning of a conversation, and really our intention when we were kind of thinking about hosting the AGM was, can we get through the AGM stuff kind of quickly so that we can actually dive into these kinds of conversations where we can actually have real dialogue about these impacts and actually learn with each other together. So I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate the panelists, Spence, Lyra, Kelly, Eva, and your deep care in all the work that you're doing, and just in taking the time to continue to educate us. And we'll work on getting those calls to action done for the next AGM. We should pass like a motion that we all must, thou shalt, and we'll raise our hands and everything. So I thank you for also to the audience for being here, and I wish it was in person because I can't see many of your faces, but I appreciate your showing up and being here and learning together. And so maybe